Hello, and welcome to the DM's Book Club, a podcast where we read about some Dungeons and Dragons and discuss how we might include it in our role-playing campaigns. Today, I have a very, very special guest, someone who I literally met 30 minutes ago, but I feel like we're going to be very, very strong friends. Their name is Hreg Misterioso. Was that it? Have I got it right?
You got it right.
Can't see me, listeners, but I'm cheering because we had at least a 5-minute discussion to make sure I get this right. So, Hreg, how are you, my friend?
Yeah, I'm good. It's a beautiful morning here, and I'm really pleased to be invited to have a little conversation with you about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general. And yeah, this is great.
Yeah, just for the listeners at home, we're recording on a Sunday morning, and so we're all both feeling very fresh. And it's not in the early time as well; it's just gone 10, so it's all very good. So Hreg, we'll just start off then. What is your RPG experience? Like, how did you get into role-playing games?
Oh my gosh, how much time do you have? So I'm going to have to date myself here. I'm one of those, really annoying 40-somethings that still gets carded at Sainsbury's. So I've been playing the game since I was quite young, and that puts me back into like Stranger Things times. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of I guess you could say, a contemporary of the Stranger Things kids. I started playing role-playing games back in probably, it must have been like mid 80s. Mm-hmm. And I was 7 years old, I think.
Wow.
It wasn't Dungeons and Dragons that I started out with. It was a role-playing game called Star Frontiers. Now, I don't think you've probably never heard of Star Frontiers. I think it's been out of print for about 30 years. But it was Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons, tried to get on the Star Wars bandwagon. So we created a space opera role-playing game, and it was Star Frontiers. It was very, very much in the style of Star Wars, but obviously without the Star Wars
the copyright.
Yeah. One of the kids in my neighborhood came around with a copy of this game, Star Frontiers, and I remember we sat on my porch one summer afternoon during the school break, and we just played this game for hours, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing.
Nope.
And I don't think anybody else did either. And I was probably the youngest. I was like 7. And I think the other kids were like 10 or 11, 12, but I fell in love with it. Yeah. And I wanted a copy for myself, but had no idea how to find it, because it was one of these things that was only available like in these hobby shops, were really hard to find. Like if you were a 7-year-old, you had no idea.
Yeah. It's like a mission in itself. Yeah.
Yeah. So I tried to create the game myself because I couldn't find it. So I used to share my bedroom with my older brother, and my only place to go for like escape, to be by myself, was inside my closet. So I could kind of like crawl inside my closet, and that was my safe space. And I just spent, I think, like 2 or 3 or 4 days just living in my closet, writing a game of basically what I thought Star Frontiers was. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever wanted to play it. But and why would they? It probably would have been horrible. I think in my 7-year-old mind, everything I'd written was brilliant. But I think if an 8-year-old looked at it, they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" So that happened. And eventually I did find a copy of it, and it was in the mall toy shop, weirdly enough, buried underneath all the other board games, where the box had actually been crushed. And it was on clearance for like, I think it was like $3 or $4. I actually had $3 or $4. So I was like, oh my God, the gods are shining on me. So I got this thing and I took it home and I read it, and I was fascinated with it. But I kept seeing at the bottom of the box, it had a purple box with this beautiful Larry Elmore cover. But at the bottom of the box, it said, "From the creators of Dungeons and Dragons." And I didn't really know. I'd heard of Dungeons and Dragons, but I didn't really know what it was. But that eventually led me to discover a dungeon. If the Star Frontier stuff is so great, Dungeons and Dragons has to be amazing, right? So then I found Dungeons and Dragons. That was the beginning of a love affair.
That's amazing. So would you say then, over sort of your RPG career, have you been more of a player? Have you been more of a games master, or has it been a mix between the two? Because it sounds like you writing what you thought was the version of games, and technically already doing game design, which is pretty game mastery anyway. So do you prefer being one role to another?
Well, the thing is, I always aspired to be a dungeon master when I was a child. but I was never very good at it. It took me many, many, many years to get to the point where I could like run a game or a campaign that wasn't completely ridiculous. And I think that was one of the reasons I moved from that Star Frontiers game I talked about earlier to Dungeons and Dragons was because, I still think that science fiction is difficult to game master. I think it just requires a lot more preparation, thought, like intellectual engagement than fantasy. I think fantasy is just easier to devise. And I think what happened with Star Frontiers versus Dungeons and Dragons was it was like, I could not come up with interesting concepts for science fiction. That was like above my 8-year-old brain. But Dungeons and Dragons, at its most basic, you could just play by drawing a maze on some grid paper and then writing monsters into the little rooms, and then just let the players run around the maze and fight the monsters and find treasure rooms and trap rooms. And that was enough. And when you're 8, 9, 10 years old, entering into this hobby, that's a lot easier, I think, to kind of to get your head round.
I completely agree with you, actually, thinking about it, because science fiction, I love science fiction. I'm a massive fan of it. But you're right. I think because the rules of, say, physics or science aren't the same in science fiction, like you might not have any gravity, you might have time travel, etc. Having to think about that, and then from my experience of game mastering, it's a lot of improvisation. Having to improvise it, and then you'd hope to justify it, because all good science fiction has a justification somewhere which people go, that's believable. I think it's very different compared to like, okay, you're in a fantasy setting, the rules are set in a sense, but if people are, that doesn't make sense, you just go magic, and people go, that makes sense. Like,
exactly.
It's a very easy justification. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, and it's more than that too, because like everybody has a shared language for fantasy and mythology and fairy tales and things like that, which we've been exposed to since we were tiny little children. Whereas science fiction, if you're creating a science fiction universe, you have to think about your own alien races. You have to think about what do the spaceships look like? How do they work? What kind of planets are there? What kinds of, interstellar encounters do you have? There's just so much range of issue. And even if you play a more less sort of broad space opera science fiction, but more of like a cyberpunk thing, you really have to know about how the world works. You need to know how civilizations work and communities work. And as a kid, you don't have that adult knowledge. So it's very difficult. I think I've always considered it very difficult, and I have great respect for game masters who run science fiction. I think it's a really, it's a great challenge. I love science fiction, obviously. And I love fantasy, but when
it comes to running them, you're like,
for
fantasy.
Running games, fantasy I find easier, and I can improvise it better.
What topic have you brought to us today? What is our topic of choice?
So, we talked a little bit about what books we could bring to the table, but the one that I kind of fell on, I really wanted to talk about this game called Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG, or also known as DCC RPG, which is put out by Goodman Games. It's not that new. It's been around since the copyright says 2012, but I feel like it maybe came out a year or two after that. Yeah. Like I said, it's come from a small independent publisher called Goodman Games, and they're both best known for putting out sort of 5th edition and 3rd edition modules with a heavy emphasis on dungeon crawls. But they put out this system where they just wanted to play with some of the bigger ideas, the kind of things that they liked from the old school games, that they felt a little bit of that was lost to time, but also just to try some new things and experiment with the game, because I think they felt that the game had gone a bit stale. And so that's where this Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG thing, I think, came from. And I've always wanted to talk about it because I think it doesn't get enough attention. And I think there's a lot of things in it that the 5th edition Dungeon Master could maybe pick and choose from. I mean, not necessarily saying you need to play the system itself, but maybe there's some ideas here that you can take away just to spice up your game.
Definitely. And we were talking off recording just now about this idea of obviously reading or playing other RPGs other to D&D just to become a better player or a better DM, because you're right. I think a lot of times if you solely stick to one game, that's all you ever know. That is sort of your world, your bubble. But if you look at other games such as DCC, you'll be like, that's a really cool idea. They've got this really cool mechanic. Can I put it into my gaming no matter what the system is? So I think absolutely. And when you talked about it, you very kindly actually gifted me the full rule set, which I must say the Amazon man, when he passed it to me, I was like, what are you buying? And I was like, I don't know. And I was like, oh, it's very heavy. It's a very thick book. So from my point of view, we are talking from the quick start rules, but it is a very beautiful book, an incredibly beautiful line illustrations as well. Very, so again, of that sort of classic sort of like illustrations from, for me, from the sort of the 80s and 90s of like when you would open up like a magazine or something like that of dungeon crawling and adventures and stuff. So yeah, very excited to talk about this because it's something that I've up until recently not really been a part of. I had like the sort of the free quick start stuff from, I think it was a free RPG day, which I managed to get, and then never looked at it. So yeah, really fascinated to see where we go with this.
I mean, just I sent you a copy of it in part because, I'm trying to do my part to promote this and get more people excited about it. And maybe one day you'll give it a go. Maybe even with me, who knows?
Absolutely.
But it is a beautiful book. I believe I sent you the foil cover one.
Again, our listeners can't see it at home, but yeah, we've both got our own copies here. And it's like, wow. And it looks, I can imagine this being on the bookshelf and people going, what is that compared to other things? And just being out and just having a flick through is just incredible.
The more common cover has kind of has this warrior who looks a little bit like a hippie from the 60s. I think he's got bell bottoms on and he's, entering into a cave with a mouth and a face on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's the more common one, but it kind of goes in with the throwback to the 70s psychedelia. It's a bit metal. It's a bit prog rock, I guess. But the artwork is beautiful in the book. I'm going to say, I think it's important to say up front, this is DM's book club. So I'm going to just say that it's not literary. You don't want to read this. You don't want to read this book. It's not Salinger. You're not going to be wowed by the qualities of the authorial language or anything like that.
No, it's definitely not written player friendly. It's definitely this is for you, the game master. Here are the stuff you need. Go. And actually, I appreciate that you sort of utilitarian aspect to it, because sometimes you're looking through some books and you're like, this is great. I love, A star for creative writing, but where is the mechanic? Where is the stuff, which is what it does very well. So I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, it is. It's a mechanical book, but there's such interesting stuff. Most of the artists in it are sort of classic first and second edition artists. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but I'm sure some of your listeners will know who Errol Otis is, or Jim Holloway, Jeff Easley, these guys who drew the books during the first edition and the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And they kind of were brought back to work on this book and to contribute some artwork. And it's clear that the authors of the book, great admirers of their works, and have really featured the artwork prominently throughout. You could get lost in this book. You could definitely, where do you begin? Yes. Sometimes the question on this book, but it's just full of great little ideas. We'll talk a little bit more about that.
That's a great sort of segue, actually, Hreg. When we're looking at this, where would you say we start? Like, what is the essential sort of core bit of DCC, if there is a core bit? Because I appreciate it. Like you said, it's certainly in the full rules, there's so much to it. But if you had to narrow it down, like, what would it be?
So I think the thing with Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG is that they wanted to create a world that's unstable, that's chaotic, that's strange, and mysterious. And they're bringing the mystery back to magic. I think, gosh, if there was one thing in particular in Dungeon Crawl Classics, which I cannot stress more, that I love and that I think more people should take an interest in, is the way the spells and the magic works in this game. We're all familiar with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. And if there's one thing about 5th edition, which, take it or leave it, it's that the designers intentionally built it around a magic infused world where literally magic is everywhere and it's commonplace, it's ordinary. Mm-hmm. People are using magic to mop the floors in the tavern and so on, building buildings with levitating rocks. And there's going to be all this stuff going on in Dungeons and Dragons, and everybody has magic and all the character classes have magic, and magic is freely available to you as a magic initiate background or whatever. Literally, magic has to be everywhere. Ecologically, to play the game, there has to be magic everywhere. And that kind of makes magic less magical, in my opinion. What Dungeon Crawl Classics does is it makes magic dangerous.
Yes.
It makes magic unknowable. It makes magic incredibly powerful, but also destructive. So when you cast a spell in Dungeon Crawl Classics, you have to refer to a random table to find out what your spell does. And, if you critical fail in Dungeon Crawl Classics, your spell will backfire in the most bizarre and mysterious ways. And if you roll high, your spell could be way more successful than you want it to be. But it also has really interesting flavor to the magic. So when you cast a spell, the way that it manifests can be different every time. So let me just give you an example. There's a spell, Spider Climb. We know Spider Climb. Everybody knows Spider Climb. It's a classic Dungeons and Dragons spell. But if you were to look up the Spider Climb in Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG book, which is on page 156, if you're curious.
Yes.
There's a few rules for it. When it manifests, so when you cast the spell, you have to roll a d4. Okay. And then depending on your roll, the effect is different. So on a roll of 1, you actually grow spider legs out your back, So you have these giant spider legs coming out of your back. That's interesting, isn't it? Doesn't that make combat more exciting? Doesn't that make casting spells more exciting? If you roll a 2, your caster's hands and feet become covered with a sticky ooze, and that's how you climb things. If you roll a 3, your fingers and toes glow with a strange orange light. And if you roll 4, the caster grows 6 additional eyes, eyes around your eyes like a spider. But that's only the beginning, because that's the manifestation. That's not the actual power of the spell.
No.
The actual power of the spell is then determined by your spell checks roll. So unlike D&D, where you cast a spell and it works, here you have to cast a spell like a skill check. And depending on how high or low you roll, you get a different effect. Obviously, if you fail the skill check, nothing happens, the spell fails. If you roll 1, you can have a misfire, which can cause all kinds of horrible things, like turn you into a baby spider, and then somebody can step on you. Or if you roll really high and you have your bonuses and you get over 30, then for the duration of 1 hour per caster level, the caster and all allies within 10 feet gain the additional climbing ability of a spider, even when using gloves and shoes, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that thing of like, the powers of these spells are so unpredictable, and there's so many different ways that a spell can manifest itself. It's really fascinating.
For me, reading this through, and like as you sort of pointed out, all the spells have a skill check from the player. The monsters don't get to dodge or anything like that, but it's this idea that magic is unpredictable. And I think there's a little section in the quick start guide saying you don't use magic for lighting a torch. You use an actual torch, and don't be idiots about this. And I love that idea that you can't really prepare for it. So like in combat, you might be on your last legs, people are running away. You go, I've got this one spell. I don't know if it will work. And I just love that you're almost like a last resort using these kinds of magic. because you just don't know. Like, again, you can possibly predict with like, oh, well, these modifiers, we can at least get over like a 10 or something like that. So you might have a thing, okay, these ones won't be doing it unless you get a natural one, which you said is sort of like the worst thing, because obviously you get failure, you get this idea of misfiring where it goes back on you, or the gods, I believe in the cleric class, they look unfavorably on you. So this idea that if you constantly get natural ones, like, was it natural failing range, I think it's called, where this idea that the more you fail, the bigger the roll is. So you might fail on a 1, 2, or 3, 4, 5, and if you keep failing, it's just going worse and worse and worse. This idea of sort of bad luck following you everywhere and just being, the worst cleric for a whole day because your spells are just going wrong. So that, I think that's actually quite interesting, because I think when you think about D&D, of course you're like, well, magic is commonplace. Like you said, any person has access to it depending on the campaign, but this idea of like you can access it if you want, and giving that sort of thing, if you're going to do this, you've got to be ready for the consequences. And I just like that idea of not being able to predict what the spell can do. I think that's really interesting. And like you sort of alluded to, in all of these spells, there's almost like 2 pages with, like you said, like how it manifests, the misfires and corruption stuff, and then what each spell does. And I actually like that as a flavor thing. Because sometimes, in the moment as a GM or as a player, you're like, it just goes off. I just cast fireball. It's like, well, how does it look like? How does it? And this gives you so many cool examples about, like you said, with the spider climb. Because in my head, it's like, oh, you just walk up like almost like a Pippi Longstocking up a wall, but actually the idea, it could be legs. You could just have goo like Spider-Man. And I just quite like that, it gives these options to be like, this is what it looks like this time. Because I think it said, well, like in the wizards class, you actually don't know what spells you're going to get. Again, it's very random. You just roll it and then work it out from there, which I just love that. This idea of magic is so random, dangerous, and you should totally use it.
Yeah, it's great. And to me, it kind of helps define the whole world, because, you think, because corruptions happen, because a wizard over time becomes more and more mutated by all of the failed spells that he casts over the course of his wizarding career. They might start growing tentacles, or he might have extra eyes, or who knows what. The idea with magic is you're ripping holes in the fabric and order of our universe. You're fundamentally breaking the laws of nature when you cast spells. So that has consequence, but that also explains the game world. You don't need a big, long history to explain why things are, because it's clear that people are messing with powers beyond their comprehension and causing all kinds of issues. So that's enough to say, why is there a monster that's eating the villagers? Well, it's probably because somebody was tampering with powers that he couldn't control, right? And it infuses the whole campaign setting. And I really dig that. And I know there's different approaches to role-playing games, and different people want different things from their role-playing games, and maybe the this kind of darkness of this concept and the magic is dangerous, and characters are probably doomed for pursuing the very thing that they're meant to be pursuing. And I know for a lot of D&D players, they just want the heroism. They just want the they're can't handle the idea of this sort of character death, that sort of thing. But I just really like it. I think it's good.
You know what? There's something about, like, there was another game I've not played. Again, I've read about it. We interviewed the game designer for it for What Am I Rolling a couple of years ago. Best Left Buried, which basically it was a bit like everyone is a part of a guild essentially, and you send parties into the dungeon to excavate it, a bit like miners. But it's like this in a sense of like, this is the grim, dark reality of being an adventurer. It's not glorious. You do this. And looking at the quick start guide, you start off at level 0 as uneducated, unskilled peasants, which I thought that was hilarious in the book. This idea of like, we're going to do this adventure regardless of what it is. And it actually encourages you in the book to like create 4 characters, and we'll go on to the character creation in a second. But this idea that you've got to, don't be attached to them. They could die easily because of the way they've been rolled up. But just to quickly go back to the magic stuff, because the thing that made me really interested in this, like you said, it's unstable, it's unknowable, a bit like that science fiction element we're sort of talking about before. But this idea of spell burn, if your character really wants to guarantee that a spell to work, you can sort of make a deal with the GM, I believe, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but this idea of having almost like a hard bargain or a tough choice. So the example it gives in the quick start guide, this idea of a wizard life or death situation needs to make sure that their spell goes off. They'll call upon an archdemon who they've had past dealings with and offering to share life force, so like 7 points or something to give you a 7+ to your next spell check. Again, I like that idea that you're again, that idea of corruption, that you're just doing anything you can to save yourself in the short term, but have this long-term consequence, this idea of spell burning and adding your ability points and having that hard bargain saying, do you want to do this? You need to give me this. Again, I love that. Again, it feels very not knowing the consequences or not knowing the full picture. It feels very Cthulhu in a way as well. Mm-hmm. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, there's definitely a heavy Cthulhu influence on the design of this game. And I completely agree with you. I love the idea of spellburn. I've used it in my Dungeons and Dragons games, that idea of the sacrifice for more power. There's an attribute in this game called luck, which it's one of your standard attributes along with strength, etc., agility, intelligence. But it's the one that can go down. So you can burn luck to get rerolls. But of course, the lower your luck gets, the worse things are for you. Mm-hmm. Because there's negative modifiers and bonus modifiers, just like any of the other ability scores. So as luck gets down, you start to get negatives on things. Yeah. And the idea that you can, cut off a pound of flesh for some extra power is really cool. There's also for clerics, and I love this about Dungeon Crawl Classics as well, and I think it needs to go into D&D. You mentioned earlier, I think, if they critical fumble on their spell casting roll, they basically upset their god. Mm-hmm. And why did they upset their god? Well, you can kind of work that out in your role play, but it might just be the unknowable, because gods are fickle. Mm-hmm. So you've earned some negative ire from your god, and your critical then goes from 1 to 2. And then, the second time that you anger your god, it goes from your critical gets up to 3 and so on until the point where, at some point you have to give a sacrifice to your god to win its favor back. And that's so important. And it really drives home the idea that you are working on behalf of a deity. And I feel like that doesn't happen enough in Dungeons and Dragons, where we remind clerics, where we remind priests, you have to do what your god tells you to do, or it's going to take away your powers. You're suddenly going to find that you can't heal anybody anymore. You're not going to be able to turn the undead because you have upset your gods. I tried to do that once in my Curse of Strahd campaign. I was I wouldn't say I was disappointed in my player, but the player made a decision which I thought was very much against what the gods would like. And so I said, actually, you try to cast a spell and it doesn't work. I got into trouble for that, right? I was being a bad DM for doing that. So I wish that the game had more of that in its rule system, so that to justify my actions as a dungeon master, I wasn't just being a jerk, but they assassinated somebody, and he was a good cleric, and I just thought, come on, now you can't just kill somebody and expect not to be punished for that.
Yeah, in DCC, it makes it very clear about the main two classes that have spells. You've got clerics and wizards. And it makes it very clear the distinction of where their magic comes from, that wizards will just take and harness it. And then, it's that sort of wizard warlock idea. Witches, it describes as well, this idea of like we're harnessing what we can and we're learning about the unknowable, and hence that idea of corruption. Whereas clerics are, being almost like figureheads for this deity, going out doing what the deity's agenda is and stuff like that. So of course, if you don't fall into line with that, you're going to get some sort of comeuppance about it. It's very much like, I don't know if you've read at all, there's Mythic Odysseys of Theros, which is a source book that's come out in D&D in the last couple of years. And it's all Greek-inspired mythology, but it has this whole thing about piety. The gods and religion is such a big part of that society. It's more likely you will have a god that you would want to be advancing that agenda of, and you have a piety score. And the more piety you get, the more benefits you get from it as well. Obviously, if you don't do it, the less you get and stuff like that. But as far as I remember, there's no real negative stuff in that. But it does encourage you to be like, well, maybe, if they lose out favor of the gods, then maybe something does happen, maybe a role play thing. But I think with this idea of like a mechanical thing, it's not working. I think that's a really interesting thing to do. And I think it makes sense story-wise if you've done something bad and it's not what your character would do, or if it's like outside of things, it makes sense to be like, hey, remember you did this at the beginning? Well, now this is coming back to bite you. And I love that idea of storytelling and consequence and it having an actual impact in the game. I think that's really interesting because then it's like, how do you get over this obstacle? How do you give recompense for it? So yeah, all about that. I think it's a good idea.
And again, it's that thing as well, that gods are unknowable and we think we know what they want, but sometimes we don't. So you could have the most perfect cleric behaving totally in line with all of its rules and still rolls a 1. And the player says, but how's that possible? Why would the gods be disapproving of me? I've been perfect. But then, religion sometimes does that. I mean, we're not going to get into a Bible discussion, but the story of Job, where God punishes his greatest disciple. So, gods are like that. Sometimes they do things for their own selfish reasons.
And I think making that clear to me, as reading this sort of document, I was like, this comes very clear off in the setting. But again, maybe double check with your player saying, hey, the gods are definitely fickle in this, just FYI. And I think just making sure they are aware of that before you start playing a game of DCC. But I did want to circle back to you talking about fumbles as before. This idea, obviously, if you roll a natural 1, that is a fumble. And I will say this for DCC, there are lots of tables. I mean, Wizards of the Coast, I love their tables, but DCC, I think have one-upped them in that. But all the tables are...
They've 3-upped them. So there are tables within tables within tables here. And it's almost like they're having a laugh sometimes. But
I think all the tables are important. Whereas I think in some of the most recent editions of D&D, obviously in that one, it's always like, here's a flavor thing you could do as an optional thing to give you ideas. Whereas stuff like in the spell stuff, like we were saying before, like roll a D4, here's 4 options to see how your spell looks like and stuff like that. I mean, you don't have to do that, but I like the fact that all the tables in this book are related to a mechanic, and it explains like this go to this table, it'll explain this. And I can imagine having this book out and being okay to read from it, because you're not expected to learn all of this stuff like you'll have notepads. But I just want to say with the fumble stuff, what's interesting is that as with most RPG systems that uses a D20 as their main mechanic, obviously the higher you roll, the more chances of success. However, on this one, on the fumble table, I think it's what you roll. The roll is modified by the reverse of the character's luck. So this idea that lower is better on the fumbles table, and you're looking at it and like the first one is like you miss wildly, but miraculously no other damage is caused. And you're like, if that's just a miss, you go down, you go, oh no, and it gets worse and worse and worse as a result. And I think that's really interesting because again, I really struggle sometimes when there's like a natural 1. I go, you miss and you drop your sword, whereas this, I'm like, ooh, this is a bit more interesting, a bit more in depth, that you could add consequences to spells going wrong or attacks going wrong. So I think it's just really interesting. Like there's one that's just come here, like your weapon becomes entangled in your armor. You must spend the next round untangling them. In addition, your armor bonus is reduced by 1 until you spend 10 minutes refitting the tangled buckles and straps. So again, it's like, because you're inept. I think that's what's come across with all this, is that you are inept characters because you are literally trying to get through a dungeon at level 0, and that's okay. And I think I just like that as a result. Like, you are not heroes; you are basically surviving.
Such rich storytelling that can come from these random tables. Some people think, "Oh, I don't like randomness in my game. I want everything to be, sort of pre-planned." But this stuff has so much flavor, and it's capable of creating so much more interesting storytelling opportunities, real stories that you're going to want to share with your friends, later on. Remember that time that this happened or that happened. And I think, I love a good random table. I think random encounters are underrated. Random events are underrated. But I think in particular, as you said, the tables in this are both, mechanical and also very richly flavored. And I think that's really good.
Another really nice segue into that. What I think is the heart of this is that when you were looking at character creation, it says at the top, as you might have guessed in DCC, it's completely randomized. Everything you do is this almost going against the sort of norm, this sort of anarchistic approach to creating stuff. And it says like you need to make at least 4 characters. You're going to roll for everything. If you pick anything like, oh, I want this, it doesn't work in the character creation. You have to roll for everything. It's a very simple, straightforward character creation as well, I think, like compared to some other ones. And I think what's nice is that you then come up with all these random types of characters. And some, you're like, this character rolled incredibly low on all these things. That's not going to survive the dungeon. But it's like this idea of like, you're not min-maxing. That's the thing it said. No. This is the whole point. It's completely random, and you just have to do your best with what you've got. And I think that's so empowering when we're now in a D&D age, which I enjoy. I will say this D&D age of like, you can do whatever you want. You can be an owl person. You can do this. You can do this, and people will pick stuff, and that's the character they want to do. That's what they want to play. But there is a joy where it's like, here's what you've got, and you go, bloody hell, how am I going to deal with this? Because then I think with that, you actually learn how to deal with different characters who are, very different. Like you could have a wizard or a cleric who have a really low personality skill score, so then they're going to cast less spells, or you're going to have an elf or a dwarf or a halfling that have different bits and pieces. Like certainly for me, again, we've not really explained this, but there is no such thing as race and class. It's just one. So humans get some classes. So if you're a human, you could be a cleric, warrior, wizard, and thief. And then the others are just elf, dwarf, and halfling. And that's it. And I'm like, oh, that's quite interesting. And then looking at them in sort of a bit more detail, stuff like the elves have an aversion to, have a weakness to iron. And like, how do you deal with that and stuff? That I found really interesting. Like they're all very different. And you just have to, and I'm sure in the full book as well, I'm sure there's more weaknesses or more a bit more filler to it as well. But I just, to roll that randomly, go, okay, you have this, and you go, oh shit, I don't know what to do with this. But I like that. It's very interesting, very different.
You hit on a few things there that I'd love to talk about.
Please.
Let's be honest, the racist class thing is always going to be controversial. Yes. A lot of players will just hate that idea, and probably is the hardest sell.
I agree.
For DCC RPG. I almost wish they had included rules for an alternative to that, but that was harking back to old D&D, because that's what the original Dungeons and Dragons system back in the 80s that I started playing. That's how it worked. So halflings were hobbits, and they were very specifically kind of like a cross between a fighter and a thief. And the dwarf was just a fighter who was good with underground stuff, and the elf was kind of a cross between the magic user and the fighter. And so they've kind of brought that back in this, and they keep referring to something called Appendix N. Yes. I'm sure you've seen the references to Appendix N. I don't know if that means anything.
Nothing at all.
Okay. So Appendix N appears in the original first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide.
Okay.
So there were obviously lots of appendices in that book, but N was Gary Gygax's list of his favorite fantasy books.
Okay.
So he had grown up reading lots of fantasy and myths and things. This was very much an inspiration to him when he was developing Dungeons and Dragons. And it's not just Lord of the Rings, he had real fascination with obviously Conan, but he also had a fascination with a fantasy writer named Poe Anderson. And I believe Poe Anderson was responsible for the alignment system. I think he actually spells out where you think, lawful good, neutral good, all that kind of thing. That's all based on a novel by Paul Anderson. I've never read it personally.
Okay.
It's all in there, apparently. It must be a really boring read to read about that in a novel. I don't know. But Paul also wrote some stories about elves, and that's where the idea of the silver, the iron allergy that elves have, it comes from his books. It also comes, I think it might even come from Norse mythology as well, like going back even further. But to get back to my original point, the Appendix N just has this list of old, often forgotten pulp fantasy that was a big influence on early D&D, and obviously on the creation of DCC RPG. Yeah, so that's what that's all about. But about character creation, it's interesting as well because what they encourage you to do. So they have this concept called the funnel adventure. And the funnel adventure, everyone plays a 0 level character. So you are not a warrior or a cleric or a wizard or a thief or a dwarf. Well, you could be a dwarf or an elf or a halfling, but you basically roll 4 characters, maybe even more, depending on how many players you have. So you have a bunch of characters and they all get together, and their most basic characters. They only have a few, they have their ability scores and a few other things. They have occupation. So you might be a farmer or a wheelwright or what have you. And that kind of defines what your skills are. It also gives you a weapon. But usually that weapon is something like a pitchfork or like a table leg or something like that.
Yeah.
And the idea is you're a bunch of villagers. Usually the standard sort of setup is you're a bunch of villagers on the frontier somewhere and something bad is happening. And you guys get your pitchforks and your torches and your sticks and you go to deal with the evil threat that's attacking your village. And most of you die. And that's the character creation process. I'm using air quotes as I say that, because the characters get whittled down until only the best ones survive. However, in my experience, the worst ones tend to survive. Really? Yeah. Because what happens is you get your good characters. You think, oh, this one's a squire, so he's got a sword and he's got some nice ability scores. He's going to be a survivor, right? And the guy who's a gong farmer. I don't know if you know what a gong farmer is. That is literally somebody who shovels poo.
Oh, I did. In my head, I was like, yeah, but then I was like, I hope it's not that.
They make the fertilizer. You think the gong farmer, he's got a shovel. He's got poor ability scores. He's not going to make it, right? Well, what happens is you always end up sending your squire in.
Of course you do, yeah.
To fight. And then he dies. And the gong farmer, who you haven't been playing, you've just kind of let him be on the periphery of all the scenarios. He ends up living because you haven't got him right up into the combat, you know? So then you end up with the gong farmer with the poor ability scores, making it to level 1.
That's so funny. I hadn't actually considered that like that, almost like ideal versus reality. I was like, yeah, of course you'd send the best one. Oh no, they're dead. Fuck. I'll send the second best one. Oh no, they're dead. Fuck. Because yeah, as I started talking to you before, they had this the marching order. Which it describes, again, it assumes that you are around a physical table, but this idea you have your 4 or however many more sheets, and the sheet closest to the table is going first as a marching order. So as if you're going down like a maze or something like that. That's the order they're going in. And I like that idea that you're like, oh yeah, the shit shoveler is at the back. They'll be fine. And then it's like, oh, it just sort of weaves through the rest of your party. Go, well, time to escape.
No, it's good. The funnel adventures can be great fun, in part because you don't have any expectations and you just get to see what happens. To be honest, most of the games of Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG that I've played have been these 0 level adventures kind of as one-offs, and they've been wonderful. Going back to the idea of race, again, it is randomly determined. Like you roll a die at the beginning and you might roll that you're an elf or a dwarf or a halfling. And I think that's interesting because I always thought, like we can't choose our parents, right? So to me, I kind of like that idea. But obviously, if you do roll an elf, you have a lot of advantages over the other players at 0 level. But at the same time, it maintains the idea that elves and dwarves and halflings are rare in the world, and that again appeals to the idea of the mystery of the fantasy world that you've created, which I think is so good and so important. I've had D&D groups where every single character was a demi-race or a non-human race. And so it starts to kind of break from what's meant to be the established world where humans are the dominant race and the other races are kind of existing on the fringes of human civilization. And it kind of, and that becomes kind of weird, especially in something like, I talked about my Curse of Strahd campaign from a few years ago. The guy playing the Dragonborn is the only Dragonborn in that whole world.
Yeah.
And then how are you supposed to portray horror? Because Ravenloft, Curse of Strahd is all about horror. You're supposed to draw the idea that everything is scary, but like the party is a bunch of elves and half dragons. They're the scariest thing in that world. Let's be honest, right? People
are frightened of them. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So it kind of undermines the mystery of the world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, because I've run a little bit of Strahd recently, and I sort of said to them, as like, the only stipulation I had was like no creatures that can fly. Just because, like, again, it sort of breaks the game in a way, because obviously when you're level 1, you can just fly away. It's a bit like, oh, that's a shame, But I think I made it very clear. So obviously, this is a bubble domain of dread, and I said to them, I described it like majority of these folks are humanoids or humans, and they've been under a lot of pressure, but they've also been oppressed. And so seeing these new creatures, if you're choosing to be a class, I won't stop you, but you're going to get a sense of it, and they might not be as helpful to you. And I tried to do it from the point of view of like, well, if we're seen as to be helping these creatures, we don't know anything about them. We don't know who they are. Has Strahd sent them? All that sort of thing. So they're going to keep abundantly clear, rather than, again, just trying to portray it like that. And I think what's interesting about this in DCC is that for it to be completely random, I would be okay with that. But I think that's the one thing I would improve on, is that make sure that every class or every race, or I don't know if there was a word for it when it said about putting them together, has a weakness of some sort. And I actually thought the iron thing was quite interesting. I was like, oh, that's an interesting role play thing, perhaps. But maybe the dwarves are sensitive to sunlight, or halflings have some other sort of environmental thing, and the same with the clerics and stuff like that. I just for me, I was like, I'd like to see a weakness with every occupation, we'll say, because obviously, like they said, it puts it together, and I wouldn't have a problem with it. But that's the only thing with the elves thing. I thought that's really interesting. That's the only one that has. But maybe you were right, because obviously elves can do a lot more. Maybe it's like, oh, here's the balance: is that if they come into contact with iron, like vampires or anything like that, then they will get some damage for it, and you have to role play that. So I don't know. I think the only other thing that came up for me in that sort of sense is looking at the abilities of the classes, and the thief class gets to do a lot. There's like a lot for them to do, and I think I've looked like over like 5 or 6 abilities, but they're all like sneaking, lockpicking, or backstab, all that sort of thing. So all sneaky stuff. And maybe it's because with the other classes you have like obviously randomly generated spells, so you don't need to describe it as much. But I just thought like it just seemed a shame, like you had this sort of thief stuff, but then maybe halflings could see in the dark and had luck, like extra luck and stuff like that, and that was kind of it. So that was the only thing for me. It was just like, it did feel to me there was some classes had a lot more stuff, but maybe that was just the way it sort of balances out. I wasn't sure from my first read through of it.
Yeah, I think that does go back to like the old school Dungeons and Dragons, which was definitely not balanced. And I think with thieves, the classic thief class, they started calling them rogues with 3rd edition. The classic thief class was the jack of all trades. They were the skill class. The idea was, your warriors, they could bash things. Your wizards can cast spells, your clerics can heal, and your thieves can do stuff, right? They had skills back in the days when skills weren't a standard part of the game. You didn't have proficiencies as such. So yeah, they were terrible in combat, thieves, completely useless. The original thief class, you had a D4 hit points, which made you.
Oh, what?
So that was your hit dice. Every level was D4. So you were which was the same with wizards.
Yes.
So you were very, very, very fragile, and you had to more or less avoid combat. The original AD&D as well was very strict on thieves' weapons. You only had, you could basically carry a sword or a dagger or and I think that was about it. You couldn't even carry a bow. People don't know this. You could, as a thief, you weren't even allowed to have a bow or a crossbow in the original AD&D, which pretty much meant that the only thing you could do in combat was try to sneak up on people and backstab
and stab them. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And so I think this DCC RPG does throw back to those the old way of the thief being the primary skills character.
So, yeah. And I will say as well, because it talks about alignment as well. And like, I think it was just determine or choose your alignment, and you've got lawful, neutral, or chaotic. There's no good or evil per se, but certainly looking at in a quick start guide, I'm sure it's slightly different in the full one, but it's like table 1.7 skills feeds by level and alignment. So if you're a chaotic thief, you know, as you go up the levels, you get more and more powerful, that stuff, because I guess that's just, again, role playing wise, whereas obviously if you're lawful, it's not as powerful. And neutral, you know, certain skills are more powerful than others. So that was, I thought that was quite interesting. I hadn't considered alignment having an effect, like a modifier on that per se. And I think that's, I believe it's something you can choose rather than roll for it.
It is something you can choose. And I agree with you. It's a really interesting way to take the thief class in a new direction. And all the classes do little things that make them a little bit more interesting. The fighter or the warrior class, for instance, has something called Mighty Deeds of Arms.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's pretty, like, it's meant to be quite loose by design, but it basically means that when the warrior makes an attack roll, they also roll a second die, and whichever die that is determined by their level. And we'll talk about, I want to come back to the dice chain in a minute. Yeah. So hold that thought.
I will.
Put an asterisk here. But the warrior then rolls that die, and as long as he rolls a 3 or higher, basically, he gets to do some flavorful action along with his attack. And there are tables for that if you wanted to refer to the rule book for what your mighty deed of action is, you can go to a section in the book on that, or you could just be creative with it. So you say, my warrior is going to, strike the orc, and then he's going to leap onto the chandelier and swing across the room and try to land on the wizard. And so you roll your attack die, and you roll at the same time, you roll your deed die. And if you get a 3, you succeed to some extent on your mighty deed of action. Now, I say that, but in Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG, the dice start at D2. So there's a dice chain. I want to talk more about polyhedrals, but I just want to say there are D2s used in this game. There are D3s used in this game. Of course, there are D4. There's D5, D6, D7. What the heck? D8. There's no D9.
No.
Nobody figured that one out yet. D10, and then there's D14, D16, D24, D30, obviously D100. And basically any kind of polyhedral die that science is able to create have been introduced to this game. So when you make that mighty deed of action we were talking about a moment ago, you might be making that roll with a D3. So you only have 1 in 3 chances of achieving it. But as you go up in levels, that die increases, which means that your mighty deed of action has a better chance of happening.
Yeah.
And if you're a good game master in this, you will have different levels of success based on how high the roll is. And again, that's kind of made out in the book, but it's still left a bit vague because they really wanted players who play warriors to be creative with their actions, which is interesting as well. The warrior often, or the fighter class, is often the class that people fall back on if they're not really that interested in role playing and all that sort of thing. And they just want to like smash things. Yeah. But this kind of encourages them to think outside the box and engage in combat in a different way and use their imagination a little bit more. So I really like that. And it also prevents the game from kind of settling into sort of rote actions in fifth edition as a fighter, as you get into your higher levels, you have certain powers, and you tend to use the exact same powers in the exact same order in every combat.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, and situationally, it doesn't, there's very little influence. You might use your battle master skills to do the same thing all the time. So this kind of encourages you to think about the environment you're in, and how you use that from a storytelling perspective. Yeah. And it also means you can do crazy things. You might have a very, very, very successful attack, which, you kill the main baddie or knock out the main baddie on your first attack because you get lucky. That's possible. And I like that.
Yeah, no, reading this idea of a deed, and like you said, it is purely flavor, but combat related, so that you don't increase your damage, but like it is, like you say, you're pushing an enemy back, you're tripping them, or you're moving, something like that. And it's so cool to think that actually it's like, again, it feels random. That whole idea is like, here's a situation, you go, okay, well, I'm going to do this, and it's just happen. It's an extension of your action, and dwarves get it as well. And I just think that it's just a really interesting thing, because like you said, I agree that this idea of people falling back on hack and slash, constantly, because they're not, either the environment hasn't been described as well as it could be, or you're not sure, so I'll just go fetch this. I think this just like you said, encourages people to think outside the box, and also I think encourages GMs to constantly describe what is going on, and I think that's a very key thing, certainly in combat. Like, we can rely on maps and we can rely on minis as much as we want, but ultimately to get across in theatre of the mind and to describe things as simply as possible and say, like, this is the state of play, and doing it at the beginning of everybody's turn, just be like, hey, this is happening, you've got people here, here, and here, but there's also this environment, and having people ask questions about it. I'm always a fan of people asking me clarified questions. I don't find that's irritating at all. I think that's like, cool, I've not described it properly, I'll go into a bit more detail. And me saying that, re-emphasizing that, other players can also hear it as well. They go, okay, I can do this on my turn as well. So I think that Mighty Deeds of Arms is just a really interesting mechanic available to warriors and dwarves, and I really like that as a thing that they can do. I think it's really cool.
We're going to go back to that asterisk now, the footnote, and talk about the dice, because as I said, it uses all these different dice, and to me, this is one of the ways that DCC RPG most points back to the joy of the game in the olden days, going back to those 1980s when I picked up Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, bringing this whole thing full circle. I can't tell you how amazed I was at the age of 8 or 9 when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons and I opened up that box and I saw a D20 for the first time, or I saw the D8 or the D10, and I just thought, wow, because I'd only ever seen, cube D6s in my life. And it was part of the magic of the game for me, of the discovery, and then wanting to own as many dice as I could. It became this fascination. And now it's kind of like the standard array of polyhedrals have become quite commonplace over time. Now, like, people aren't really that impressed with a D20, even if you're seeing it for the first time, somewhere you've seen that before, somehow. But DCC RPG, I think they wanted to tap into that excitement about these strange, mysterious dice. And that, I think, is why they introduced some of these more rare dice. They're referred to as Zachi dice because there's a dice maker named, I don't know his first name, but a Mr. Zachi, who was one of the earliest manufacturers of polyhedral dice. And he invented these other quite bizarre looking dice for odd numbered dice. You're starting to see them, but they're still pretty rare. And like the D5 is a very strange looking die. I'm not sure I trust it. He swears by it. He says he's tested it, that it gives accurate results, but it looks quite strange. But just the idea of then you have to go look for these interesting new dice. I find that taps into a childhood joy for me, finding these new dice. And when I see a strange die somewhere at a convention or something, I get so excited. I'm like, I can use this for Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like there is something about, I'm always a big fan, like I'm sure you're like myself, Hreg, where I've got various, I pointed to them just then, I have various different sets of dice so that as you said, the traditional just polyhedric set. But I think what I find interesting is that it does say, obviously, so if you don't have these dice, this is how you work out what that number is. So obviously for a D3, you just roll a D6 and then half the number rounding down and stuff like that. So there is a way to do it. And obviously now we have online dice rolls. But you and I are going to both feel like it's not the same, which I appreciate. It's a very old person way of saying that. But I think they are fascinating to the idea that you said, like odd number dice, like having a D5 or a D7. It's just really interesting. So you're like, how does that work out and stuff like that? So I guess, can you describe to me and the listeners as well, how does the dice chain work? Because obviously we've talked a lot about the D20, that you use that for pretty much everything. So in what circumstances would you use the other dice then?
Right. So the D20 is still the primary die for Dungeon Crawl Classics RPGs, but there are situations where instead of rolling a D20 to perform an action, you might roll a die that is one step higher or one step lower on the dice chain, or maybe several steps either way. So to give you an example, the warrior that we were just talking about, as they go up in levels, instead of rolling a D20 for their attack roll, they start to be able to roll a D24. And I don't know if they get high enough level, they might roll a D30. I can't remember offhand. I've certainly never played a warrior of that level. But also, they get second attacks eventually. And when they get a second attack, their weaker arm rolls a lower die. So they might roll the D14 or the D16, and it goes up and up depending on their level. So it gives you a range. Obviously, armor class works just like traditional Dungeons and Dragons. So you have to achieve the armor class to have an effective hit, but it's harder, obviously, if you're rolling a D16 than it is to roll a D20, and it's easier to roll on a D24 to hit, right? So what it does is it replaces all of those annoying modifiers with dice rolls, which to me is just funner. Like it's just more fun to roll a die and take the result as it's rolled than it is to roll a die and then, I have that +2 and +6 and +3 for all this. Like looking over your character sheet to make sure you haven't missed any adjustments. Instead, you're just rolling a die, and it's the dice get bigger and stronger as your characters get bigger and stronger, or they get weaker. So the game has very basic skills. I'm talking not about attributes, but I'm talking about proficiencies, as you might call them in 5th edition. There's literally one page about skills in this book. Right? And it's just kind of, you make it up. It's like, if your occupation was gong farmer, then you're good at maybe digging ditches.
Yeah, shoveling. Yeah.
You know, whereas if you're a scribe, you might have some language skills, that kind of thing. And you just have to make the argument to your game master that I'm skilled in this. And your game master might say, I don't think you are, actually. I don't think you're a learned gong farmer. You're not going to be able to translate ancient Thulian, but you can still make the skill check. But instead of rolling a D20, you roll a D10. Right. So a skilled person rolls a D20, an unskilled person rolls a D10. And that saves you from having to manage all these pluses and minuses, which sometimes just get a bit annoying, I think.
Yeah, no, I definitely see, like, it definitely simplifies it down. And this idea again about it is random, because you could have the best dice in the world, like, like you said, a D24, D30, if that's the thing for your character, but then you could roll really poorly. And I think that's, again, this idea of random, overcomplicated stuff, that you do these dice, and it might seem when you're reading this, like there is a lot to take in, but I would feel comfortable having like the tables with me. I think all the players would probably have tables and their own different tables as well, because each character has different things, and that's okay, because obviously you're not expected to know all this in your head. And especially and it simplifies it down in other ways as well, because obviously there's no attacks of opportunity, there's no feats, and as you said, no skill points as well. So that's like, you don't need to worry about these things. It is just simply like you can do an action and move, and you can do maybe a few other things depending on your character. And here they are in a very nice summary way of doing it. So yeah, I think it's very interesting in a very different way to play it and stuff. I can imagine players being a bit worried maybe to begin with, because like, oh, there's so much, all these different dice stuff. But once you got this idea of the chain effect, like you said, like, hey, you're now a level higher, so you go to one higher in your D thing. And just being that confident GM saying like, just follow the dice chain, here are the simplest rules for it, and going from there. I think it is a completely different way to play. And I just really, there's something exciting about it, going, how can I put this in? This idea of like, oh, you've hurt your main arm. We're going to move you down to a D12, even in a D&D 5th edition scenario. Because again, some of these dice don't get as much love as they do. Like,
I love the D12.
I know,
the D12 is the most, unloved die, isn't it? They barely ever use it. But I love it. It's a beautiful die. Out
of that traditional polyhedral set, that's why I'm a big fan of barbarians, because they get to use D12s, and I'm like, that get use of that D12 out. But it's a very interesting thing, and I'm gonna have to look for some of these. What did you call them? The zucchini? No, that's
Zocchi dice. ZOCCHI. It's mentioned in the introduction to the book. There's a series of it's kind of a statement of intent. You're supposed to read it first, and if you don't agree with all of the ambitions of the text, then you should put this book down now and find a different game. Yeah, but it does say, you know the works of the great mage Zocchi and are prepared to exercise D3, D5, D7, D14, D16, D24, D30, and so on, and should they need to be deployed. But again, I think Zocchi was one of the original founders of TSR, which was the original company that made Dungeons and Dragons before Wizards of the Coast bought them in the early aughts. So I think he was very key to the foundation of Dungeons and Dragons, and he eventually went on to have his own game shop and develop dice, and because these dice were quite rare back then, back in the old days. So I think he kind of went into business of being the man with the dice.
Well, unfortunately, Hreg, we've come to the end of chatting about DCC. Is there anything you want to, almost like a take-home message, or one last thing that's like, hey, why should people want to play DCC? What is it that is sort of the big selling point you want people to take away from this episode?
Oh gosh, I think that it's a refreshingly different take on fantasy role-playing that still has familiar callbacks to both old school and modern Dungeons and Dragons. And I think it just brings, I've said this a few times today, but I'm going to repeat it. It brings the mystery back to fantasy. Sure, if you want to play the superheroes, 5th edition is going to be your thing. But if you want to try being the anti-heroes, the ordinary folks who maybe make good, to be a reaver, a cut purse, or a scoundrel, or a tomb robber, this is a system to give a go, and at very least have a leaf through it someday, and maybe find some ideas that you might use to improve your own game.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Hreg, is there anything you want to plug, any of your own work, even if it's something like, oh, I saw this on TV, or I read this book recently, I really enjoy it. What projects have you got coming up, or what things do you want to promote?
Well, I'm not actively promoting anything myself. I'm just a game master, and I'd love to play with more people and get to know more members of the community. So I'm not actively promoting anything myself, but there is one thing that I would recommend is Questing Time, which is a event which happens, I think, monthly, and it's a group of improv comedians playing Dungeons and Dragons in a club in central London. For those of you who are local, it's always great fun, and they're full of ideas, and you can really be entertained watching a group of people who are endlessly clever, having a great time playing Dungeons and Dragons.
I can definitely second that as well. I didn't realize they were back in person. That's amazing because I used to go to a couple of their shows pre-pandemic. They've also been doing stuff on Twitch as well, so you can look up that. I think weekly they've been doing it on Twitch, and the DM Paul Foxcroft as well, amazing DM. He's done stuff for if you probably have heard the name when he's done Comic Relief does D&D. He did all that for that as well. Really, really interesting. And he's actually has been doing some of the D&D celebrations, I think, in the past as well, when he's run for games and stuff in person. So highly recommend checking his stuff out as well. Really, really good, and definitely supporting other tired GMs and DMs having to deal with the antics of their players. So I completely second that one as well. I just guess I'll quickly sign off because I do have stuff to plug because I'm very busy. So my name is Fiona. I run the What Am I Rolling podcast, which is a twice monthly RPG one-shot podcast. As always, it's going very well. Obviously, we cover a wide range of other RPG systems, and I think at some point DCC will definitely come up now because, again, this idea of randomness sounds really cool. Coming up, we've got Vert, the sci-fi RPG system, which is based on the original book, but also uses the Cypher system, which is a brand new sort of system to me, at least. Really, really interesting. And I'm sure there's other bits and pieces coming up as well. I always forget when I get to this point because, again, it's that idea of like, is it in the future? Is it in the past? I never remember when these episodes go out myself. Also, season 3 of the DM's Book Club is being streamed exclusively on Dragon's Duel Twitch. Obviously, we have now collaborated with Dragon's Duel. We've got Hamilton as our regular guest host now. We'll be sending out episodes Thursdays at 9 p.m. BST/GMT on the Dragon Duels Twitch. That's dragons_duel if you look for us on Twitch. And finally, we have an offer code, 10% off your first purchase from Third Space Gaming, your friendly local game store in Burnley, which is where I'm originally from. You should just type in the offer code DNBC into checkout. You get 10% off, and it can be on anything you want. It could be DCC. I'm sure they'll have copies of it there, or Terrain, or Wargaming, whatever you want. Get 10% off. Hreg, it was absolutely wonderful talking to you. And the listeners out there, I'm sure you can find out more about stuff in the next episode, which we'll probably be playing right now. I don't know. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.